Hello, this is Christina Caudill. I'm an evolutionary astrologer, and I have been trained through Mark Jones Pluto School. And today I'm really excited to present to you some work based on my own research on the astrology of creativity. And this specifically is around creativity and the soul's expression. As we know, in evolutionary astrology, there is a great emphasis on what the soul is here to express. Why did we incarnate? And what is the highest expression of that soul's intention? And we'll be focused specifically on one artist, the artist Jean-Michel Basquiat. And if you don't know his work, don't worry. We will go into his work, his life. Very, very fascinating story. Fascinating and tragic at the same time. But I hope you'll stick with me. I think it's some very fascinating astrology, as well as, when we take some of these kind of extreme examples, they can really show us the fullness of the potential of our soul's journey. So if it's all right, I'll go ahead and begin sharing my screen. Okay, let's see. Can you see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so the title of this presentation is Creativity and the Soul's Expression. And as you can see, that's kind of an intense painting there, but it is one by Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was a neo-expressionist painter. So he sort of revolutionized expressionism. Using both abstract painting as well as poetry and music and all kinds of representation and figurative work. So we kind of just threw it all out there, right? But in some way, for most people, I would say, that resonate with this work, there's something that comes through. There's some kind of message, even though it isn't maybe something we can clearly articulate. When visual art is sort of doing its job, doing its best, it is a window into the soul. And there's many ways of being creative. You don't just have to be pushing paint around on a canvas, but this is one way that we can see how the subconscious can actually come through these type of material. Okay. So I wanted to start with kind of putting things in context, because when we look at astrology, most of us come to astrology because we want to know ourselves in some way. Maybe there's something that keeps coming up for us that we really want to get more clarity on. And other people come to astrology because they think that there's some kind of secret that they want to unlock that can help unlock their creativity or their success, or help them align more with their destiny, or a sense of satisfaction in life. And those are all really, very valid pathways into your astrology. But when it comes to the self, we look at self-actualization as something that is not even about doing, but really about aligning with our being. And actually, in a lot of spiritual traditions in the East, those are all around self-actualization. As we know, the Buddha was enlightened or self-actualized after meditating under the Bodhi tree. And so it's not about achieving success, it's about actually coming to an awareness of the self. Whereas self-expression tends to be more of a pathway from the West, right? In the West, if we have a life where we feel like, it's lacking meaning, or we aren't really able to be ourselves and express ourselves, that tends to be what a lot of our sort of spiritual lineage is around. And we want to kind of just distinguish the two, because you can be self-actualized and not fully self-expressed, or you can also be self-expressed and not self-actualized. And so the beauty of astrology is we have the potential of self-actualization through creative self-expression. This is one way we can access our astrology, by knowing ourselves at a deep level, and not even knowing our conscious selves, knowing our subconscious, right? That is the beauty of evolutionary astrology, because it can help us to see beyond what we know of our persona, what we know of our conditioning, to really understand ourselves at a deep level. And through doing that, perhaps we can find a way to express ourselves in a more creative way, in a way that really speaks to who we are continually evolving into. So for today's presentation, I'd like to introduce you, if you don't already know, introduce you to Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was an American artist. He was a groundbreaking artist. His field was neo-expressionist. If you don't know what that means, it's not a big deal, but it's basically, on the abstract realm. But not purely abstract. He, as I said, he incorporated a lot of different imagery and materials into his work to create something completely unique. He also was involved with political and social commentary, which at the time was also pretty groundbreaking. When he arose in the 80s, what was really big at the time in New York was minimalism. So just these like paragraphs of color and pure color, or sort of almost nearly blank canvases, or installation art. And he came and started a conversation around his experiences of being Black in America, around even, the police brutality at the time that no one was talking about. And, even now it seems like a conversation that still needs to be had. So he was quite ahead of his time, and this was in the early 80s. He had a very meteoric rise. He rose when he was in his early 20s. But unfortunately, by the age of 27, he died of a heroin overdose. He was part of that 27 club, unfortunately. A bright star that shone very brightly and had a very short life. But what we'll look at is we'll take a look at some significant turning points in his life and see what the astrology might illumine for us. And so what I thought was interesting was he was born on the winter solstice that year, 1960s, December 22. So his sun was at 0 Capricorn. And we'll take a look at that, because we don't tend to associate artists with Capricorn, right? We tend to think of Leo or something with Venus, Libra. But he actually had a very strong Capricorn, which actually really worked in his favor when it came to his ascent as an artist. His father was actually quite well-to-do. He was an accountant from Haiti who married a Puerto Rican woman, which was his mother. And they really encouraged him to follow his talent for art. At the age of 6 years old, his mother made him a junior member of the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And he always credited just going to the museum for teaching him art. He'd said later that whenever he would enter any kind of like art contests at school, he would always lose, because he would want to be doing these like expressionist type of works even when he was a child. And the award would go to someone who made like a perfect Spider-Man. And so at a very early age, he had a very cultured sort of taste when it came to art. And he really knew what he felt was significant and important when it came to expressing himself creatively. And so very early on, he showed signs of artistic ability that even a teacher of his mentioned it to his mother, and his mother then encouraged him to draw. She also was interested in design, in fashion design, and she would sit and draw with him. So they had that bond when it came to drawing and art. I hope you can see this because I've got these. Okay, I'm gonna like close this little window at the bottom. Hopefully you can see this chart. Now this is a solar chart. I don't have a time, unfortunately, for Jean-Michel Basquiat, but using the sun on the ascendant, you know, we can even look at solar houses. I've actually been using them, and they can really give some information. But just so that we know, this is a solar chart, so we don't really know the houses, and we don't know the moon totally, which is really kind of disappointing because, you know, he obviously had a very strong bond with his mother. So, but he either had a late Aquarius moon or an early Pisces moon. But either way, that moon would have been conjunct Chiron in some way. You know, we can sort of assume it would have been like within orb of Chiron. But when we just take an overall view of this chart, I mean, the thing that stands out at me being an evolutionary astrologer is that Pluto is exactly by degree conjunct the north node of the moon in Virgo. And so what is the Virgo Pisces axis about? When we think about Pisces being about the spirit and also about the type of art that can break through boundaries or that can inspire. And it can also be about really wanting to escape the pressures of the world. And that Virgo likely is some kind of a soul intention to bring meaning into life. And perhaps even when it's well integrated with the Pisces, is bringing the sacred into every day, bringing the sacred into one's work, having work and service that is significant and meaningful, not only to oneself, but perhaps to the collective, especially with an outer planet like Pluto conjunct it, and mastering it, being a master. And that also is echoed, I believe, by those, the Capricorn planets. But Pluto, according to the Jeffrey Wolf Green School, is a symbol of the soul. It's this encapsulated energy that travels with us, or that is us, really, lifetime to lifetime. And Pluto conjunct the North Node indicates that the soul has been focused on this particular area, maybe through many lifetimes. And this lifetime, it's a time to get it focused, really focused, and really achieve something in this area. And so we can go back to that as well. But really, we want to look at, I think I have this here in the next slide. Oh, well, we'll look at the rest of the chart later. So I did want to point out one significant turning point, probably one of the first significant turning points that's often mentioned in the life of Jean-Michel Basquiat, is in September 1968. He was 7 years old, and transiting Chiron was actually where it is now in the sky at about 2 degrees Aries, and it was tightly square Jean-Michel's natal sun in Capricorn, so that's a Chiron sun square, and he was hit by a car. He was playing in the street and a car like hit him, and he broke his arm, and it was so severe he had to have his spleen removed. So it was a very serious accident. And actually, it's said that potentially one of the reasons he lived such a short life was because he, didn't take care of his health, obviously, but also did not have that spleen. And when he was in the hospital, he was given a copy by his mother of Gray's Anatomy. And that Gray's Anatomy book was highly influential for the rest of his life. He actually ended up, he was in a band he called Gray's because he, was so influenced by Gray's Anatomy. And as you can see, these works were from, much later in his career, throughout his career. And at the bottom left, there's an image there of a skull with like scars on it, or like these, the stitching, which was one of his signatures. And then you can see the rest of the these paintings had to do with, they look like images of anatomy. And to him, it was a way of really understanding the self. And this is another thing that we look at with Pluto in Virgo. It's really going deeply and at a minute level understanding the self. They say that Virgo is about digestion. And so the Pluto and Virgo generation, or anyone with any strong Virgo signatures, needs to sort of pick things apart, take things one at a time, and focus and digest information emotionally and mentally as well. So this to me speaks a lot to that Pluto in Virgo North Node. And if we were to just focus on, again, the Pluto North Node and the South Node in Pisces, again, we don't know the houses from his natal chart, but if we look at this in terms of solar houses, which I know a lot of astrologers use solar houses, we can see that these are in the 9th and 3rd solar house. So what's that about? It's about learning and teaching and knowledge. It's about knowledge versus wisdom, right? So we often see the 3rd house being about learning and knowledge and data. And the movement toward the 9th house would be taking that data and elevating it to wisdom, elevating it to a belief or to a knowing about the world around us, or about the world that we live in, and going beyond the safety of one's own, the 3rd house is like one's own neighborhood or one's own tribe, and the 9th house being about the exploration, further afield, the exotic, things like that. And often when we see Pluto conjunct the North Node, I mean, that, again, that can be someone that can make a profound impact on their generation, or even beyond death, beyond their own life. So when I chose Jean-Michel Basquiat's chart to do this, I didn't even look at the chart first. I said, oh, I know he will be interesting to do. So to see he's got Pluto conjunct the North Node, I was very excited about that. And then when we put the nodal rulers in, now I'm using Neptune as the modern ruler of the South Node here of Pisces. Neptune's trine that South Node and sextile the North Node. So a sextile to the North Node often is a way of helping that along. But we also, we can't ignore that Neptune in a trine in water signs is really going to still be very, very deeply connected to that South Node in Pisces. And what does Neptune tend to represent? Our ability to envision, to dream, to connect to spirit, to connect to the all. And on the shadow side, it can be about things like escapism, delusion, fantasy, and even, unfortunately, things like drug addiction or any kind of dependency. And so, but this really powerful sextile, the sextile of Neptune to Pluto, that is someone that can have a really powerful vision. And again, this would be maybe a generational signature, but we also do look at this generation, born in the early 60s, as really being necessary for them to help us dream into our future. And they have done, that generation of the 60s has done a lot to help us get more connected to the earth, to our spirituality, and to the possibilities of human evolution. And then the North Node ruler is Mercury in Sagittarius, right? And so Sagittarius, here we have that echo of the 9th house. Mercury in Sagittarius, first of all, Mercury is how we learn and how we assimilate information. And Sagittarius is about our belief systems, what we choose to believe about the world, what we know to be true. Even maybe if we don't have the data to back it up, but knowing, like a deep knowing of truth, and a truth seeker, really. Because anything, when we look at Sagittarius, it's about the search, the constant, continual search, and perhaps always wanting something new when it comes to the learning and hopefully eventually sharing of that information, because Sagittarius is about, spreading one's knowledge. And so we look at the period where Jean-Michel was finding his voice. So he began as a graffiti artist. And how that transpired was when he was about 13, his parents divorced, actually, and his mother entered into a mental hospital, which she was the rest of her life, like in and out the rest of her life. And she lost custody of him. So him and his two younger sisters had to go live with his father. And he was not very happy with that situation, apparently. His father was quite a disciplinarian. And Jean-Michel was quite a rebel. And he went to some of the best schools, the best private schools around Brooklyn. But he was never satisfied. He was not a good student as far as sitting there and learning. Maybe that Mercury in Sagittarius wanted something more expansive, exciting, new. So at age 17, he dropped out of school, and his father was so angry at him for dropping out of school that he kicked him out of the house. I mean, he had tried running away a couple of times already, so he just was not trying to be at home anymore. And once he left home, he went to New York City, and he just survived, stayed on people's couches. He was very charming. He kind of knew how to get his way. He just kind of lived like a vagabond, I guess is the word. And he started creating graffiti art with a social commentary. And what's interesting was, at the time, again, in the early 80s, graffiti was everywhere. But no one considered it art. It wasn't connected to any kind of art. And what Jean-Michel Basquiat did was, he had a message and he wanted to be seen and heard. He was very ambitious. Yes, he was homeless, but he was extremely ambitious. And all his friends and everyone that had interviewed about him afterward had always said that from very young, he knew he was going to be famous. He wanted to be famous. But he also had a voice that he wanted expressed. And so he actually started doing this graffiti with a partner, and they called it Samo, like same old stuff. And not only did he just graffiti these very sort of interesting haikus, obviously he's very well educated, but he did so very specifically near the art galleries and near really popular nightclubs. And by 1979, 1980, he was a sensation. Everybody wanted to know who Samo was. Although he hid himself for the most part until about the end of 1980. He was interviewed on some local TV station because everybody was dying to get to know him. So he created this mystique already and this interest. Again, he picked up something that nobody else ever thought of at that time, making graffiti an art form. And so that alone was groundbreaking. So this is the event chart from December 1980, when he was really at the height of this Samo fame. And as you can see, transiting Neptune, the ruler of his south node, was conjunct his natal Mercury. And then we also see that the transiting nodes were coming to square his natal Neptune. So, in the life of a person, we see that there's usually a planet or a signature or two that really seems to come alive in the life. And for him, even though he was has very Capricorn sun and everything, Neptune seems to really sort of trigger his chart, make it come alive. That's when significant things happen around Neptune, either his natal Neptune or transiting Neptune. And so that Neptune on his Mercury releasing that messenger, right? You know, the Mercury is the messenger. It's also the trickster. And in many ways, he was both. And so here we see that release here, as well as the transiting nodes coming to really sort of give a sense of urgency to his natal Neptune to awaken and to spread his message in a certain way. And really quickly, he started having breakthrough success. That year in 1980, the magazine Art Form, which was, you know, this is a highly respected magazine in the art world, featured him, and they called him the Radiant Child, which I thought was, I forgot that he had been called the Radiant Child. And my practice, my astrology practice is Radiant Astrology. And so I was like, oh yeah, maybe that's another reason why he's speaking to me right now. But he was in a group exhibition in at PS1, which is this sort of like the nonprofit art collective or museum for up and coming artists, for like the next big thing. And there were many artists in this group exhibition, and he was by far the standout. And this was the type of work he was doing, obviously, that was, again, a total break from what was on mode at the time, which was very minimal work, very serious minimal work. And he brought a sense of freshness to it. And that's what everyone would say. It was his work was so fresh, and it would like speak to you. And he would listen to his favorite jazz artists when he would create his work, so that they would be infused with that movement and that energy of jazz. And so really within 2 years, he went from having no money to suddenly selling artworks for between $10,000 and $25,000 each, which at the time was quite significant, especially for an up-and-coming artist. So in March 1982, he had his first solo exhibition with a New York gallery, and the work sold out. And it said that he made around $200,000 from that first sold-out exhibition. And so there was something about him that really resonated, that clicked with the collective. And that, again, is another sort of outer planet, especially Neptunian sort of influence, is when we can be attuned, when a person can be so attuned to the collective desires or the collective need, or whatever this energy is that's needing to be touched on. It's like when they say something about there's no stopping an idea whose time has come. You know, he seemed to somehow be able to be the messenger for that that sort of aesthetic and that message that was ready to be heard. And so when we look at, this was the opening of his exhibition at, I forgot her name, but Nina Antonio or something, but at that gallery where he sold out his work. You know, look at this. Jupiter was exact on his Neptune, his natal Neptune. So there again, we've got his Neptune being very significant. And Jupiter is also the Chaldean ruler, the traditional ruler of Pisces. So these are essentially the dual rulers of his south node coming into alignment. And so it's interesting because, The South Node gets a bad rap a lot of times when we see it in evolutionary astrology. But I think now there's more and more of a movement that it's really about the nodal axis. They are not separate. Dana Rudyard says you cannot just focus on one node. It doesn't make any sense. They are an axis. They are inextricably linked. But it was almost like, if you would look at it from in terms of multiple lives, that he spent multiple lives with this message that needs to be released, that can bring inspiration to the masses. And we can also look at it in terms of Neptune being trine his natal Uranus. Right? That Uranus bringing that excitement. He was born with the Uranus in Leo generation. And he brought so much freshness and excitement to the art world, and also some controversy, because he was both a critical success for many people. Of course, there's always going to be those detractors, but the detractors didn't like that he was also a commercial success. And he was one of the first to really bridge those, where suddenly, like, he could resonate both with, the club goer kids, as well as the sort of high art world collectors and curators. So we have Neptune releasing that Uranus, the great awakener, in Leo, the sign of, the entertainer, the king, even. And you could even say that, transiting Pluto was sextile his Uranus as well. And transiting Pluto was also trine his Chiron, And so when we look at Chiron of being the wounded healer, but it's also the maverick, and what more maverick can you get other than Chiron in Aquarius, the sign of the outsider and the groundbreaker. And, in some ways, Chiron and Aquarius can feel alienated or alien from their contemporaries, because a lot of times there is something there that they are meant to bring that maybe the world isn't ready yet or hasn't seen yet. And so when we look at Jean-Michel Basquiat's work, even now it seems really fresh. At least I really think so. And so, to think this is work from like the early 80s sometimes is kind of, that in itself is kind of shocking, because nobody else was doing that. So you can see all this outer planet activity here really happening. And, this is 1982. So what will continue to happen over the next years, the South Node will transit his Saturn, Jupiter, Sun, and that he'll continue to have success that will almost be kind of easy to him. The South Node kind of brings you that which is maybe from the past, or that which is sort of already in your wheelhouse. And Neptune will continue to then transit these Capricorn planets, and we'll see very shortly that for him was a lot of success over the next few years. Here was a quote from Jean-Michel about his work. "I don't know how to describe my work. It's like asking Miles Davis, how does your horn sound? I don't like to talk about my art." And this is a example of one of his paintings that has, some of his idols, Dizzy Gillespie, and I forget, Charlie Parker is the other one. And he saw himself as, being sort of the jazz artist of art, of contemporary art at the time. He was also called the Black Picasso. And he was fine with that. He was fine with being on, not just standing on the shoulders of giants, but being shoulder to shoulder with giants. And just to think that he had only been in the art world for a few years and was already being up there with the greats, being compared to the greats. And so he never liked to really talk about his work because the work was in some ways, not easily articulated. It's more about what it would convey from a visual perspective. And, being so young and being so masterful at the work, that is quite rare. And he purposely would make the work look like a child did it because he wanted it to evoke that sense of wonder within a person that you have only in childhood. So, he was in many ways very deliberate with this work, even though it can really look haphazard, which is very much like jazz, right? Is there is an element of the unexpected as well as a very strict work ethic and discipline. And then he had a meteoric rise. By the time he was 21, or when he was 21, he became the youngest artist ever to exhibit at the prestigious Documenta biennial, it's like happens every 4 years, the Documenta exhibition in Kassel, Germany, which is like pretty much the top exhibition you can have in contemporary art, and it still is. By his early 20s, he had earned his first million. So I don't know how much he earned throughout his lifetime, but I kept coming through this, kept coming up against this phrase that he'd earned his first million by his early 20s. So probably more than $1 million, which is just very unusual for any artist, period. But, he was very savvy also. A lot of people described him as a hustler as well, because he made sure that his work was seen, was always on top. He wanted to be sort of the king of his, the prince, the crown prince of the art world. So it wasn't just about the work speaking for itself, which it really did because he was dedicated to it, but he was also dedicated to making sure that his success had some foundation behind it and had some structure behind it and support. And that, I would say, came from his Capricorn signatures. And so he was a critically embraced and popularly celebrated artistic phenomenon, right? So he was one of the first artists that, as I said, became popularly celebrated. So here he's got, he had an Adidas shirt. He did some collaborations with Andy Warhol and some major sort of like promotions and things like that. So he very quickly became popular for being young, for being groundbreaking, and also for having just really exceptional work. And so this is, did I already look at this? Yeah, we already looked at this one, sorry. So he had an innate capacity to function as something like an oracle, distilling his perceptions of the outside world down to their essence, and in turn projecting them outward through his creative acts. This was by an art curator about his work. And so, it's interesting. He was described in these terms like an oracle. And when you think about that strong Neptune he has, Neptune in Scorpio, right? I mean, that is the oracle. That is the shaman, being able to flow with that beautiful wisdom and mixing the dark and the light. And his work really, you can see some of these almost shamanic type of influences. He wanted it to evoke his Haitian heritage, his African heritage, as well as his mother's Puerto Rican heritage as well. I mean, he spoke Creole and Spanish and English fluently by the time he was 11. And so he, in some ways, did feel alien, not just because of his mixed heritage, but also because of his, being someone who could be so groundbreaking and ahead of his time. And he really wanted this to come through his work. And here's another beautiful quote about his work by Mark Mayer, who wrote a book on his the history of Basquiat. Basquiat speaks articulately while dodging the full impact of clarity like a matador. We can read his pictures without strenuous effort. The words, the images, the colors, and the construction. But we cannot quite fathom the point they belabor, keeping us in the state of half-knowing, of mystery within familiarity, had been the core technique of his brand of communication. He painted a calculated incoherence, calibrating the mystery of what such apparently meaning-laden pictures might ultimately mean. I think that is so incredibly articulate on his work, because it is really arresting to look at his work, especially if you've ever seen it in real life, but it's not completely clear. You don't quite know what he's trying to get through. You don't quite know if there is a certain narrative. There is always that mystery, that half knowing. And so, this is what I believe a lot of this Neptune and Pluto really speaks to, the depth that his Pluto in the North Node, in Virgo, he had a very specific, very masterful stroke that just expressed such depth. But then that Neptune and Scorpio, also wanting to keep things a mystery, also wanting to tease and to keep things sort of veiled so that one never could quite pin him down. And gosh, we're nearly at the end already. He has, he did have a very, very rich life, and he was into so many things like music, and he was in a band. He was hosting events at nightclubs and things like that, as well as constantly painting. He left thousands of paintings when he after he died that hadn't even been exhibited. But eventually what had happened was, sometime in the late 80s, he began to start to feel, he was probably about 25 or something. Yeah, because it was a couple of years before he died. He started to get a little bit of a creative block, which, happens to everybody. And he did this exhibition with Andy Warhol, who Warhol was a great supporter of his from the early days, and they became great friends. And they did an exhibition together, and it wasn't well received. And he was very worried about that, Basquiat was, because he suddenly started thinking that he doesn't have longevity. He actually said to his father, he was worried about his longevity. And presumably he just meant that as far as his career, he thought he might have lost his Midas touch. And suddenly his anxiety started, and that when we see Pluto in the North Node in Virgo, anxiety can be certainly indicative of that. Once he started having anxiety and started doubting himself and doubting that he could maintain his position as this art world darling, he started using heroin more. And then in 1987, when Andy Warhol was unexpectedly killed, that absolutely devastated him. And they said that he just never could get over that, and his drug use worsened. He did try to get clean a few times, but unfortunately, by age 27, in August 12, 1988, he died of a heroin overdose. And so it is just really tragic to see that when someone can go all the way with their creativity and their expression, there's that stress of being able to keep it up, of being able to always be the darling, the radiant child. And I think that, we know that part of the lessons of this lifetime is to go with the ups and the downs and the transformations necessary. But sometimes, some of us aren't able to really transition that well between, certain life phases. And so whatever the real reason, however things happen, if it could have just been a fluke or whatever, he, in the end, it was the heroin that did him in at such a young age. And, we hear about this 27, the 27 club. And what happens at 27? That's the inverse nodal return, right? That's when the south node meets your north node and the north node meets your south node. And that can really be, jarring for some people, because that is where our past karma really comes to the fore. And we're really challenged with making certain changes in our lives. And we can maybe really see where we've been stuck or standing in our own way, or where we have habits that are not helpful to us. And of course, with him having the nodal axis in Virgo and Pisces, one of the things that this is indicative of is its health, its healing, its purity and intoxication, right? It's like detox and toxins. And so, he was actually on his way to Hawaii to go to a detox. He said he was going to quit, but before he left, he had, I guess, one last bender, and that was the last one for him, sadly. We can also see that, and this is on his death, the day of his death, Pluto was on that Neptune of his. So there again is the Neptune that really signified turning points in his life. And we can look at many other signatures. Mars, he's got that Mars squaring his natal Mars. And let's see. Yeah, so this is really, it was obviously sort of a sudden death, sudden shock to people, him being so young. But also, as we said earlier, that he didn't have very good health for some time because he didn't have his spleen and not taking good care of himself. They said that he was losing his teeth, which happens to a lot of junkies. So, it actually really is kind of poignant. We have this Virgo new moon coming up from the time I'm recording this. And we also want to think about our health and how important it is to take care of our health and to start making those intentions around caring for our health. Because no matter what we're here to bring to the world, what our soul wants to express, we live in our physical bodies. And that's really important for us to honor. And so, it can't be said that he wasn't someone that was so driven and had so much to share. So many people that knew him just knew of him as such a light to their world, which you don't usually think of when you think of someone with such strong Capricorn planets. And I can say that because I'm a Capricorn too, and we get a bad rap. But he was really ultimately here to help to wake people up to the potential, their human potential. I mean, he had no shame between earning money and being a really critically acclaimed artist who also never went to art school. The art world is very elitist and very snobby, and he never went to art school. He never even finished high school. But yet he was totally committed not only to creating powerful art that had a message, that spoke to the Black experience, that also spoke to the human experience, but also, why not? Why couldn't he make a lot of money for it? He didn't need to be ashamed of that. And he knew at a very young age he was here to do something very powerful and significant and be famous for it. So he sort of heard these calls. So when we think of the soul incarnating and what the soul is here to do, I mean, we always want to take a look at our nodes and Pluto, as well as the rulers of those, just to really get a sense of where is this that I'm meant to express myself and also know myself. You know, sometimes when we see people that are so driven, such as this, Jean-Michel Basquiat, or any artist that really is driven to express themselves, we want to also ask ourselves, not only am I here to express myself, but how deeply can I really know myself? Because oftentimes when we are trying to escape ourselves, even through work or success, or drugs or whatever, that can interfere with us being able to, even to sustain our life at a certain level. So this is where the self-actualization and the self-expression are both really important. If we really want to have full lives that are really, that we feel like we're fulfilling our destiny to its ultimate expression. Let's see. And let me see, how much time do I have? I don't have my
10 minutes.
Oh, I have 10 more minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I did want to mention that I will be doing a workshop on the astrology of creativity. We'll go more deeply into the signatures of creativity through astrology. It's coming up next month, Saturday, October 20th. I'll be doing it live at the Metropolitan Atlanta Astrological Society, but they will also be doing it by webcast. So you can go to MAAS on Facebook. Otherwise, you can sign up to my list at radiantastrology.com, and I'll have the details. I'll be sending out the details in the next couple of weeks, how you can join remotely. Or if you're in Atlanta, you're welcome to join us for that workshop. And we'll be looking at not only the, some significant artist charts, but we'll also be looking at our own charts and where our creative expression may be fully actualized. And I will say, a lot of times as we say with astrology, a lot of times we look at Leo or Venus, but I'll give you a little hint. You don't want to discount Mercury. I see a lot of Mercury in the charts of artists, especially fine artists, because ultimately they want to express something and communicate something. And so, yes, we do have our Venus that is about beauty, and we have Leo that can be about that, that wanting to be seen and the creativity where we can take risks and be bold. But I've also seen a lot of strong signatures around Mercury. So that is something to keep in mind as well. So I'm going to stop sharing. And if anybody has any questions, I guess we've got 5 more minutes. I'm happy to answer them if you have them. Let me see. There's something in the chat box. Is that for me? Oh. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes. Hi.
This is Cameron. Hey, how you doing?
Hi, Cameron. Hey, how you doing?
I'm well. Do you notice anything with like creativity and retrograde planets? Are there any correspondence that you found?
This is the thing with retrogrades. It tends to be that we take a little more time to master that planet, right? And also, we tend to see retrograde planets as well as any planets that are square to Saturn as being like late bloomers. And there's actually, there was some study done on famous artists that were, usually they were either early, what do you call it? Like when they're like prodigies or late bloomers. And both of them can be very, very, have a lot of success. And we see that in their astrology. And usually the ones with more of the retrograde planets tend to be the late bloomers. And or hard aspects to Saturn, because it's about taking time to master it. And that's the thing, is when there was I love this book. I can't remember who wrote it, but I'm going to be delving into it more in my workshop, that for some reason we tend to think that, I guess there's some fantasy that if you're not some young up and coming artist, then you've missed kind of the boat. But when they've actually found that some of the most significant artists throughout history made some of their, it's actually equal. Some of them made their contributions really early in their career, but then there was about half of the other ones that made really significant contributions much later in their career, it's kind of a shame, because as someone who, I was an art dealer for like 12 years, and it's such a youth oriented culture. They're always looking for the next young thing. But actually, it's some of the older artists that can be like the dark horses that can come out. So yeah, essentially, retrograde planets tend to be the artists that are the late bloomers, or they can be sort of like the groundbreakers, the one that have a message, especially if it's like Mercury retrograde, that is sort of thinking different, like that, the Apple tagline, think different. That's exactly kind of what Mercury retrograde tends to do. They think different. And so, yeah, so that's actually really a great question. So thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, appreciate that.
And, oh, there's that baby crying. Now that's going to be you can be the late bloomer, and your baby can be the prodigy.
I had a quick note, something that I noticed. And to sort of address Cameron's question, the late great Marvin Gaye, Mercury retrograde.
Yes. Oh, that's beautiful.
But I noticed that his Venus is conjunct the south node of Neptune. I think that's right.
Oh,
so
okay.
I kind of wonder if the nodes of the nodes, especially maybe the nodes of the outer planets, may be something that can also be looked at as far as the creativity. And also his Capricorn, his Saturn is close to the nodes of Pluto, the south node of Pluto and Saturn. So,
good eye, Wanda.
So I was kind of wondering, I was just kind of thinking, maybe, this life, even though it was so short, it may have been the manifestation or the bringing forth from what he didn't get a chance to do in the previous life, and now it was accomplished. So I don't know, it was just a thought.
I thought that too. I have to say, I thought that very thing. We think, if you don't live till 80 something or whatever, then you've had such a short, tragic life. But I thought that very same thing, Wanda, is that he had that exact Pluto to North node. And so that is saying, I've got to express this. And, we know that Pluto is that unstoppable drive. And the North node can tend to expand things, so it's like even more of that. Also, I haven't done too much research in it. It's definitely something I've been wanting to do. But like Marilyn Monroe also had North node conjunct Pluto. And yes, both of these had a tragic end, but sometimes you wonder what drives someone to want to be in that space of escape so much, whether it be drugs or dependency. And maybe it could be that, they're driving themselves so hard that there's something that needed to be expressed, that they fulfilled it. And, even when we look at the work that they've left us, some of these great stars, we can really just feel honored to even be able to enjoy it. And so what you said about the nodes of the planets, yes, the planetary nodes, it's something that I know Mark Jones has been researching in terms of mundane events, but I'm definitely interested in looking at them in terms of creativity and personal charts. So thank you so much. So I'll definitely be folding more of that in. The north node of Pluto, the north node of Neptune, which is in Leo. Barack Obama's son is conjunct that, and he's that great orator. It was such a beautiful ability, right? Incredible ability to inspire. And yeah, like you said, I think Basquiat's Jupiter is on the north node of Jupiter as well. So that Jupiter, again, Jupiter, Neptune for him was very significant. So thanks for pointing that out. Okay, well, I think that we are at time. I know my sister Capricorn, Linda Johnson, likes to keep it on time.
Yes, exactly on time. Thank you so much for a wonderful meeting on creativity and the soul's purpose.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you, everyone, for joining me.
And would you all please thank Christina Caudill, everyone?
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was brilliant.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you so much.